So to continue focusing on the meaning and the way that karma operates, one thing that is very important is the way karma manifests in its relationship to the world around us and what happens to us specifically as individuals. The things I was saying earlier about the mind's nature being like a mirror, and the things that I think will radiate from the mirror, which are simply what we would normally call reflections. Those sometimes they take this form, sometimes they take another, and specifically the forms that we could say that they take is that they appear as our bodies, our history, and specifically the process as we get older and older, and then the inevitable happens, we pass away. That becomes simply another display within the mirror. To us, of course, that's a big deal because the passing away of ourselves, our bodies, what we think mostly makes us ourselves, we see that disappearing. And grasping rears up again, so we cling very strongly to the pattern that we have already, even though somehow we may know that it's going to go. The grasping is still there. And this is the painful quality that is involved with dying, the loss of the connection that you have already. Of course, from the point of view of the actual mind, none of that means anything, because actually it's all just happening in the mirror. The mind, the nature of experience, that which is the mirror itself, never arises and passes away. It's the mirror beyond causality, beyond knowing, beyond concepts and any kinds of conditioning. Therefore, if you can relax into the quality of what the mirror is in itself, as I said, would be a way of practicing and achieving the great liberation from grasping at the qualities that seem to be inherent in the mirror. If you can do that, then, of course, death doesn't pose a problem for you particularly. There would be a further display after death, further display in the mirror with which you would get involved. And that's described in various texts in Buddhism as, maybe, dependent tradition, they would say the rising of the bardo, the in-between state, between the state of death and another birth, and takes on different aspects and different forms, but there's some kind of experience that goes on between the two. And then an actual birth of some kind occurs, and the continuity of the display within the mirror follows that. But actually the mirror itself, the mind itself, hasn't been altered, affected, changed, whatever, nothing like that. generally speaking, we say the activity of karma, which of course is activities and actions that take place within the mirror, and they produce some kind of result within the mirror. One of the wrong ideas about karma is just everything. That what you do, what karma is just wall-to-wall sense of your ongoing fate somehow. But that's not true, because from Buddhist point of view, there's certainly at least two things going on. Karma is action, but action produces results. The results aren't the actions. They've got a resemblance, a kind of connection between the action and the result. Certainly, that's true, but they're not the same. The fact that when I perform an action, a result is produced, a result that I can feel or experience, is within the range of my senses. That is not karma. That's sometimes called vipaka, which means result. Sometimes it's called phala, which means fruit. But it's the idea of what comes from the karmic action itself. And overall, we say three things come from the karma. There's your body, your mind, and the environment in which you find yourself. So those three things arise from karma. They're also within the display in the mirror. So the body, as it were, can be seen in the mirror. The mind, in the sense of flickering thoughts, the kind of contrived mind, that's in the mirror. Mind, I hate to say mind with a capital M, but the nature of mind, if you prefer, that is the mirror itself, so that doesn't come into it. And the other thing is what seems to be where your particular display of mind and body is embedded, which is the environment in which you find yourself. All those things are the results primarily of karma. Now, when we talk about rebirth or birth, new birth, people find that particularly kind of problematic, because they think, well, this body, connection with this body has disappeared. They also think, well, I can't see any continuity between what happens now at this moment, maybe the moment preceding death, and what happens afterwards. They don't seem to find it a problem to talk about what happens in this life. This life is just as much changing from one moment to another as the moment between death and rebirth. And that sense of where I am in the ongoing process of this life, something that people don't feel as a problem particularly, should be really, you might think, just as much of a problem as anything else. Because after all, what provides the continuity going from one moment in this life to the next? The thing that people think is easy to provide this continuity is the body itself. So they have the idea of the bodily patterns producing some kind of continuity. For example, that blood still goes through the blood vessels, messages are still sent through the nerves, the bones, the muscles and so on are still moving in a more or less continuous dynamic way. And because of that continuity, one doesn't feel there's a problem. So that kind of continuity of something that, in a sense, has almost a spatial orientation doesn't seem to be a problem. And the interesting thing is whether when you die, anything like that happens. And of course, according to Buddhist perspective, it does. There is, in this life, you have this body. In this life, you have a kind of fairly deep layer of consciousness, which is difficult to know what you would call that in Western terms. Possibly like a dynamic flow of unconscious experience somehow. From Buddhist perspective, it's called the Alaya Vijnana, the ground consciousness, and the idea that an ordinary person can't perceive that directly. You would have to be a great yogin or yogini to be able to experience that. Within this life, what is experienced in that type of consciousness is the stuff that gives you a particular orientation. If you're born male, then the particular kind of qualities of maleness might be there. Obviously, one important thing is the qualities of being a human being. It's possible, after all, you could be something else. You could be an animal. And in Buddhism, it's possible to be other kinds of being as well. So that sense of something that's quite basic, but refers to certain very important characteristics you have in this life, as I say, like your maleness, your humanness, or femaleness, of course, or the fact that you may have some physical problems that may be fairly constant for you, that you might have some disabilities that were physical or mental. All those kind of things might add up as to things that were some ongoing dynamic within this apparent unconscious stream of experience. Now, when you die, this body disappears, obviously disconnected from it, goes its own way, decays and so on. The mind also gives up. Instead, it's no longer the flow of the particular thing that you experience as being your maleness, your femaleness, your humanness, and so on. You pass away, that goes. And in fact, you can't tell quite what will happen next. When you pass away, when you die, there are no such things as dead human beings. When you're dead, you're not a human being anymore. There was a Buddhist, famous Western Buddhist called Christmas Humphreys. He used to say, once you become a human being, then you couldn't become an animal or any other kind of being. Well, if it was true there were such things as dead human beings, that would be true. The trouble is, there are no such things as dead human beings. When you die, that connection that made you human, or made you an animal for that matter, is gone. And there is a very powerful dynamic that happens at this time. In some sense, you might say, he's looking around to catch on to something to adopt. It's like it's looking for a karmic outlet of some kind that it can link into. It may be, of course, that it is another human consciousness, in which case you would say, well, you were going to be born a human again. However, it is possible, in spite of what people like to say and what I suppose people like to believe, it is possible that one could become an animal. It is conceivable that could happen. It would mean you're, like I was saying, somewhat towards the end, I think in the question period this morning, that your focus is narrowed by the kind of setup of your body and your senses. It is simply that if it was an animal, it would probably be, in most respects, but not all perhaps, even more narrow. Certainly, from the intelligence aspect, it would be narrowed much more. But there isn't any reason why it shouldn't work like that, why that narrowness couldn't actually happen. So anything's possible, really. Of course, it could widen out, could do the opposite, into a greater, sort of grander kind of being somehow. So that's possible as well. It's just when you die, you can't say what will happen next exactly. And what will happen next just depend on karma. And as the Tibetans say, it is what they say is mangepa, meaning it is uncertain. There is a random element at this point as to what will happen. It's not conditioned that everything in the garden will necessarily be lovely, or that everything, for that matter, that everything will be bad or negative. It's just you can't quite tell. And it depends what arises. And the arising is conditioned, it is true. So that's why it's not, when one says random, one doesn't mean it's like everything's equally probable, like a lucky dip. It doesn't mean that. There's a predisposition towards, maybe towards humanness, maybe towards some other kind of life or dependency, but towards something anyway. We'll come back to this point in a moment. I just want to follow what happens immediately after. What happens to the body, in fact, when one says that the physical body that you had before has disappeared, is gone. But there is what I suppose you might call rather mysterious ongoing body that goes from life to life. That body has this dynamic patterning that the ordinary body has during a lifetime, and this more subtle body, which one doesn't perceive generally, takes on that same kind of dynamism, if you like, from one life to the next. So it's like you have another more subtle body underlying this one, which lives from one life to the next. I'm assuming that you understand there would be new lives because of the continuity of the dynamism of the mirror. Because no longer are we dependent on the idea of materiality, no longer can you say, when you die, that's the end of you. Because you are now, as it were, the mirror itself. And what appears to be you is simply the appearances in the mirror. And they can go on, they have their own dynamic, they have their own appearances in display and so forth. But the thing that constitutes what you are remains. And the mind itself remains independently of time and space. Because like I was saying again this morning, time and place, or time and space, if you like, are in the mirror. So therefore, just to say that you can no longer say the mind is subject to time, or subject to being in a particular place, or within a particular body, or something like that. None of that would apply anymore. So there is some kind of body that goes on, as it were, from life to life. And that body doesn't come to an end until you become enlightened. When you become enlightened, it dies. So it's an immortal body, but temporarily immortal. lasts for as long as, they say, as conditioned existence lasts. It lasts as long as, for you, samsara lasts. When you become an awakened person, it dies as you become awake, because it can't stand you to be awake at the same time. But you haven't lost anything, after it was an illusory, rather pastiche kind of thing, really. Not worth much, really. A little bit more durable, if you want to call it that, than the ordinary body, let's put it that way. It's a bit more subtle than that. The other thing that goes on is the continuation of the Alaya Vijnana, the sort of flow of unconscious experience, as it were. I said that was associated with perhaps things like your maleness, your femaleness, your state of your mind, some aspects of your body, maybe your emotions or whatever, state of indicating your humanness. But the new Alaya Vijnana, in fact, is not called that. According to this tradition, it's called the bit of a mouthful in Sanskrit, the Vishva Vasana Alaya Vijnana. The Alaya Vijnana means the ground stream. Vishva Vasana means the various tendencies, or the various maybe tendencies about the nearest to it, various potentials or something like that. And it's all possibilities. Within this occurs the possibility that you could be a human, that you could be an animal, there could be some even greater being than that, that it has the potential for all kinds of bad behaviour, and all kinds of positive behaviour. It has the potential of maleness and femaleness. All these are, if you like, close to the surface. So it's like with us, if you're a male, the maleness is close to the surface. Femaleness is still there, but it's not close to the surface. It's very submerged. Similarly, our humanness is very much the surface. The possibility of our being something else is there, but it's very much submerged. In this case, it's like it's bubbling. Everything is near the surface somehow. So until karma works its way through, and the power of karma causes a fixation of some kind on something, that bubbling process is still there. Once the fixation has occurred, then that bubbling stops and you become fixed as something, whether human, animal, something grander than that, male, female, or whatever. It fixates as that for the next period of time, until that, as you say, that the energy or the power of that wears out, which it will wear out after a certain time, and then you'll be back in that same situation again. So that's the kind of process that occurs. Now, a very crucial time for any person, actually any being, but particularly for human being, I suppose, is very close to the moment of death. Then it says that there are 4 kinds of karma operate. One kind is what is called guru karma. This has nothing to do with guru as a sense of a wonderful person. Guru, the word guru just means heavy, actually. Might be a heavy person, I suppose, like the guru, but literally just means heavy, weighty, sort of like significant, I suppose you could say. Guru karma means weighty karma, heavy karma, significant karma, the kind of karma you ignore at your peril. So I'll just say what they are traditionally. They say the 5 negative ones, which sometimes they add an extra one to make 6, but we'll just talk about 5 for the moment. To kill one of your parents is very weighty and produces very negative results. Second is to kill a person with a great level of spiritual realization. The third is to wound a Buddha, they say. You might say, why not kill a Buddha? Well, you can't kill a Buddha, that's the reason. But you could injure a Buddha. Could, as they say, draw blood from a Buddha, so that's considered to be a particularly bad thing to do. And the fourth one, maybe, it doesn't sound too bad, but it is bad in a quite a deep sense. It is what sometimes the Sanskrit's called Sangha Beda, and it means Beda, it means to split. And Sangha is people who are working, practicing, meditating together amicably to develop insight, to develop wisdom and so forth. And you deliberately try and break that up and destroy that in some way. I don't know why you might want to do that, but apparently that kind of thing does happen. And that's the worst of all, if you do that, to undermine people who are living in harmony, practicing properly, really developing insight. You can see it's kind of destroying the stuff that makes existence worth living, really. It's almost the reason why one exists in the first place, to be able to produce that kind of insight, that kind of loving connection for people to what is real. And to want to destroy that, to maliciously undermine and destroy it is the worst kind of thing you could have. Sometimes, and I have to say at this point, the sixth one, they say even worse than that, is to have wrong views about the nature of reality. And that, again, might not sound too much of a problem. But the idea is if you've got really wrong views about the nature of reality, you might do anything. You might do any crazy thing. And the tendency is, once you've got those views, for you to stick with them. And they follow you everywhere, and you get very bad results from that, both bad for you and both bad for others, bad for everyone you're in contact with. So those are what they call guru karma, heavy karma. You might say, aren't there any nice guru karmas? Are they all going to be grim like that? Well, the good kinds are things like to be able to experience the depths and the width of the most expansive kinds of samadhi and meditation. Then those are things that produce tremendously useful and important results for everyone, not just for yourself, but for all sentient beings. The samadhi you're focusing on is what is called the samadhi of bodhicitta. Bodhicitta means the awakened heart that goes out to express love and compassion for all sentient beings. And to have a samadhi or meditation that strongly works on that and spreads that outwards. Yeah, that's heavy karma of the right kind, you might say. So that's and it's said when you die, whatever heavy karma you've done of that kind takes precedence over anything else. So the moment of your death, if you've done any of those negative things or you've done the positive things, then they take over. You might say, well, suppose you've done both. The answer is that you probably won't do both. If you've done the very negative, bad ones, you're very unlikely to be able to get into doing the very strong positive ones, and vice versa. So it tends to be that you kind of find yourself stuck with one or the other. The next one is called the karma that happens at the moment of death. That's a particularly interesting one. I think if you're a Catholic, you would resonate with this possibly. Because the idea is what you do at the moment of your death is important. And what people do for you at the moment of your death is important as well. Tibetans, as you probably know, as they're dying, have the book called the Bardo Todol read for them, a book that tells them about the nature of reality. and the kind of things that might happen as you're dying. Now, it would be very valuable to have somebody read that to you. You might understand it in the beginning. Later on, as time goes, the sense of hearing seems to be like the last thing that goes. I remember I was with a lady I loved very much many years ago, and she was dying of cancer. And she was really quite moribund, it would seem. And I would be there by her bedside and other people would come in. And I got into the habit of talking across her, as it were, as if she wasn't there. And we kind of did that, I suppose, once too often, perhaps speaking about her as though she wasn't present somehow. And then for the first time she made some movement, some kind of murmur to indicate her presence, and it seemed to be in direct response to what we just said. So I think that the sound, listening to the voice of somebody telling you good things, lasts for quite a long time, even when everything else is gone. So I think that's important. And even beyond that, it is said that, Trungpa Rinpoche used to say that you should read the book even if the person seems to have lost the connection of hearing as well, because that sort of stabilizes your own mind, and then the other person can link into that somehow. The stability of your mind, their mind can link into that, because in the mind very near the after-death state or just after, it's very unstable, because things keep presenting themselves, appearing and disappearing from moment to moment. You need some kind of stability at that point, and reading the book can do it. But the kind of thing that happens is you have, sometimes in some countries, they have somebody with you who knows you very well, and who reminds you of things you did in the past that were very good. That's also, good method. Often in the commentaries it said, remember how you put a gold roof on the monastery. That kind of work. It doesn't have to be quite that. Could be, remembering you've done other kinds of good deeds than that. That would be good punya from a Buddhist point of view, putting a gold roof on a monastery. But there's a whole variety of things that you could do, of course. But the idea is being reminded of those and steering clear of anything that you know from their life is problematic. If they were greedy or horrible to people, steer clear of those people. Just remind them of the positive things. It says that what happens as you get near death, then what they call karma nimittas, which are symbols of karmic actions, begin to arise in your mind. So, for example, if you did kill somebody, wouldn't necessarily be that you remember killing them particularly, but the actual visual image of the knife you stabbed them with might come into your mind. And that triggers off the whole of the karmic involvement that you have with that. Or it could be good, maybe you see the temple with its golden roof or whatever, and you're very happy about that. And it was a good deed, and it's positive, and you feel happy, and that would be a very positive thing. So if you can have that very strongly at that moment, then it's excellent. Sometimes what happens is you get there are. We don't want to get too technical about this, but sometimes there's karma, and then there's karma that supports it. For example, you've done some good action, and then it's like suddenly you remember some other wonderful action that you did as well, because you remembered that one, you remembered another one. It's like it supports it, and they will support themselves. Or it could be you did a negative thing, and then I remember doing that other negative thing as well. Sometimes it works the other way round. in that you did a negative action, then you suddenly remember something good. So the idea is that there's a kind of, not exactly a fight, but your mind is quite unstable at that point. And lots of different things present themselves in terms of imagery, in terms of remembering things. Might not be a visual image, might be you hear somebody's voice or whatever in your mind's ear, as it were. All that kind of thing is possible. And sometimes a complete replacement can occur. For example, if you maybe did murder somebody or had them killed or something, and then somebody reminds you just as you were getting into that about some really good deed you did. And that may have the power of completely replacing the negative one. So in a way, it's like what's happening as your mind is bubbling with all these things. It's very uncertain. This is the uncertain aspect of karma and the result of karma. What karma will take over and produce its result. Because the karma takes over and then it produces its result. The possibility is that the karma result that's arising might be, it's all bubbling, as I say, all uncertain. But if you've got somebody there who can help you, who can recite the book that I was speaking of, can remind you of the right actions, they're giving you nudges in the right kind of direction. Obviously, you don't want somebody there who's quite depressed, tells you how miserable everything is. So there's somebody to keep away from the deathbed, said. Even if they were happy in or liked you in that life, if they're kind of miserable, downcast person, they're going to be a bit of a drag. And more than that, they may be predisposed, the dying person, to a very bad result. So you need somebody who's level-headed and knows the person well and can say the right things at the right point. So there could be quite a skill in doing that. One could imagine, I suppose, people who almost had a profession out of doing that. And I think in some Buddhist countries that's virtually true. So it's tremendously important. And I suppose one has to say it does link into things like that you might have in Catholicism. One of the things you would get in Buddhism, you could have confession linked into it in exactly that way, where you're revealing your negativity and dropping it somehow at that point. So all those things might be positive. So the second thing that takes place after, if no heavy karma is present, hopefully there isn't, it's likely there isn't any heavy karma, any guru karma going, then the karmic symbols and actions near death would take over. Maybe for some people, not much even of that kind of thing happens. In which case, what takes over is what you did most of in your lifetime. It's perhaps difficult to say what that might be, but generally it's what you have a habit of doing mostly. And some kind of a very strong habit pattern like that is what takes over. And then they say sometimes there isn't anything obvious like that either. So what happens then? They say, well, any old thing might happen then. It's not sure what kind. Something from the past probably, but you can't say what it would be. So that's why at the moment, particularly at the moment of death, it's very important that you kind of arrange for a positive situation for yourself. I said I would talk about some of the wrong ideas people have about karma. I've already mentioned one, that is that karma is everything. Karma isn't everything because there's the results. There's the result that comes as a result of that, of the action. of the result of the volition. There's always the two things, karma and the result of karma. People also have the idea that karma is some kind of fate. Oh, it's my fate, it's my karma. You still hear people say that. That's a completely wrong idea. Karma can't be fate, because karma is volition. Yeah, your volition could be conditioned somewhat by the things you've done in your past. One of the things that is a type of karma is habitual action. You got into the habit of doing things over the years. You have the habit of doing certain actions. And those actions you have a tendency to continue to do, just because it's a habit. So that's a kind of conditioning. But you could hardly call it fate. After all, you don't have to do them. And if you're strong enough about that, you can actually not do it. Generally speaking, because karma is action, because karma is volition, karma is never fate in the sense of something that has to be. That's very important to realise that. Also, everybody says, well, karma's inevitable. Well, that isn't true either. There's some types of karma that you do in this lifetime. And generally speaking, if for some reason, karma, I should say, the results of karma, the karma only becomes active if, it's like, as they say sometimes, it's like a sprout, a plant. You've got to have the seed, you've got to have the warmth, the moisture and so on, and then it will grow, it will sprout and it will grow. But if those things are not present, then it doesn't. And with some types of karma, it is said that if in this life it never gets the chance to grow, it never grows at all. So it dies. In other words, the karma, certain types of karma in this life, if you like, they're kind of weak. If they don't reach their fruition in this lifetime, they die and they never produce any result. And sometimes they say, also because of the closeness that for the next life, that's also true. If it doesn't, certain karma don't produce a result in this life or the next life, then they die. And then there are other types of karma that go on forever, really, and could always produce a result, no matter how long time is. However, they still may not produce a result, because if the conditions for them to grow and turn into produce a result don't arise, and you become enlightened before they do, then they never do grow. So they are. Get in there first. It's sometimes said that if you do a good deed of kind that is associated with karma that is important for this life. If you were to meet a Buddha, in some sense, this doesn't mean necessarily in the historical sense, but you meet a Buddha in the sense of appearing as an appearance of other. In other words, it appears as a Buddha, and it has an otherness about it that makes it not your own personal invention. You know, we talked about that earlier. Encountering such a powerful being, making an offering and a request, is so effective with that type of karma. Is so effective that is very likely that it will produce a result in this lifetime that is very powerful and very beneficial. That is a way of practicing which actually is encouraged by doing certain types of meditation where you will meet a Buddha in your own experience, as it were, in the sense of other, in this lifetime. And then you would have the opportunity of doing that. So this is a way that you can empower your karma very strongly. So that's kind of recommended quite strongly. It's meeting the ocean of the Buddhas, or the ocean-like vastness of all the Buddha minds, all the different kinds of Buddhas there might be, to actually do the meditations and the practices that enable you to encounter them face to face, as it were, and then to pay homage to them, to make offerings to them, realizing their ability to help you realize enlightenment yourself. And this is something that almost inevitably will happen as a result of that. There's certain types of liberation. Again, we don't have time to go into them now. There's things that are called liberation by seeing. If you see such beings, then the power of seeing them would enable you to become, in the end, become a liberated being. And this is true of all the senses in some way or other. There's always some kind of liberation that is associated with the senses. There's liberation by seeing, which I've just described. There's liberation by hearing, is very much when you're listening at the moment of death that I was speaking to a bit earlier. That's liberation by hearing, because you can liberate it just by hearing the Dharma told to you at that very special moment just before death. There are others, but perhaps we don't need to go into those at the moment. So, karma isn't fate. It's too much associated with volition to ever be that. Sometimes there's the idea, I remember I had a student once who really strongly had the idea that people who had bad things happen to them had bad karma, and therefore they were bad in some sense. That's a totally wrong idea from Buddhist perspective. I could put it this way to you. If you think of the vastness of the world of conditioned existence, all of us have done everything that you could possibly imagine. You know, you don't think that you've never murdered anybody. It's almost certain you have. You imagine something that you wouldn't like to do, you can bet your boots you've done it sometime or other in the past. So none of us can point a finger at anybody else and say, you're a bad person, you're worse than I am. What is your criteria, if you like, for that? There's this endless stock of karmic actions and possible results that go back and back, you might say, into the past. Or at least, if you don't want to use the idea of them going back and back into the past, they're there in some sense already, simply because all of us have the potential to do anything. It might be it's an uncomfortable thought in some ways. You think, well, I'll remain on the straight and narrow. I won't do extremely bad things. But you know, there's always this uncertainty. You can't actually tell. Uncertainty in Buddhism is connected, it is true, with conditions. Conditions narrow the possibilities. So maybe you can't do all the negative things that are possible, or all the positive things that are possible for that matter. But within a range, which might be more or less limited depending on the individuals, what happens in there is somewhat random. So there's a mixture of randomness and conditionality as regards people's response. People sometimes feel, well, Buddhism shouldn't have random elements in it somehow. But it does. And actually that's the nature of the world. You think of it from a scientific aspect. There's always a random element in anything that happens. You can't be avoided. You can't have everything nailed down into complete certainty, because that would just become determinism. But you can't have complete, as it were, freedom, because then, anything would be possible. And none of that makes any sense, because, maybe I could just walk on the moon if I chose. But we know that can't happen. So we know there are some kinds of conditions to prevent me doing certain things. So it's always conditions plus a random element. Those two things work together. So there is this vast mass of possible actions and possible results that you could do. It's like almost that you carry that seething mass of possibilities around with you all the time. Nobody can point a finger at another and say you're a bad person because you've done this action or performed this action. So, she was wrong in thinking what she thought. However, she wasn't out of court compared with the way a lot of people are, even people in Buddhist countries. Some Tibetans, for example, are very down on blind people because they say, well, it's the result of negative actions. So all that proves that they're negative people. But that's exactly the same thing as we just said. And they are abused and sometimes even physically attacked if they're too pushy somehow. So you think then when that kind of thing happens that the truth of the fact that people suffer the way they do because of karma, the result of karma, and that's true. But the idea that somehow you've become a bad person and are forever somehow linked with negativity, that is complete nonsense. It is simply that for those people, the negative karmic result has arisen to the surface in this particular life. That's all it means. You're lucky, in your case it hasn't. But, don't crow too much. There's always next time. You never know what will happen. So one should always, and it's very much a Buddhist thing, always develop love and compassion, goodwill and good behavior and service to others. This is very important to think in those terms. It's only people who have no real understanding of the Dharma think that the realization that some person has experienced the results of negative karma in this lifetime means they are themselves negative. It's extremely wrong view, in fact. Tony Blair, you may remember there was this thing about karma and Tony Blair some while back. Everybody remember that? Yes? No? Glenn Hoddle, the football manager? Yeah, okay. He was a great, I wouldn't say great particularly. Glenn Hoddle was a sort of follower of certain belief in karma that wasn't particularly Buddhist. I can't remember the details, I have to say. But somewhere he was saying that people, it wasn't too bad a thing to say actually, that people were having physical problems because of negative karmic results. And certainly one would say that was true from a Buddhist perspective. Then Tony Blair began to get in on it. And I think he was saying, as far as I remember, that this was a tremendously unfair idea and really, not an idea that anybody should entertain. Not realizing, of course, that it was an idea quite common in the East. So he wasn't being all things to all men at that particular point. So I'll go back to the idea of the unfairness of that, or not, as the case may be. Just say perhaps that the idea of Tony Blair instructing us on the meaning of karma might sound a little bit ludicrous, The interesting thing was that there was a bishop who came on, and he gave a quite a good description of karma and said, obviously, neither Glenn Hoddle nor Tony Blair knew much about it, which was very true. And so he was quite good, described it quite well. So, is karma unfair? Well, yes, of course. What does it mean to say it's unfair? I had a friend who used this image. He said, held up his hand with one finger missing. He said, many years ago, he said, there was a very foolish young boy. He said, I don't know how long, but 75 years ago, something like that, this incident happened. And he did something very stupid. He put his hand under a circular saw and he lost his finger. And that was very foolish. They cleared it up and he went on living. Now he said, about 75 years later, he said, there's a much older and wiser man living who has one finger missing. He said, isn't it unfair that such a stupid young man doing such a stupid thing should produce an effect that affects this much older and hopefully wiser man 75 years in the future? Is it unfair? Well, yeah, perhaps you could say it was unfair in a way. You put it like that, it is unfair. But it happens. It happens, and I'm sure you get the story. But karma is like that. Karma is done in the past, and it's the effects of karma are experienced now. It's nobody's saying, it's a bad thing and that the people involved are bad. They have this problem because of they are suffering at this moment, and that indicates some kind of moral culpability. There isn't that idea at all. As I say, everybody's done everything. You can't point a moral finger at anybody. But you can say that people experience unpleasant things because of the actions that they did in the past. Those actions could be of many kinds, not just actions like losing a finger, or they could say that was karma. Could be quite become predisposed to certain types of illness and so forth. There are many, many ways in which that karma can be experienced. I've heard, maybe they would accuse me of being simplistic, I don't know, I don't feel I am. Some Christian commentators I've heard say, this terrible problem of evil, why do people suffer? These terrible things happen to people. They say, well, there's kind of no answer to it. Well, from Buddhist point of view, it's fairly simple. People experience the negative as they do because of past karmic actions. If you like, it's the simple expression of karmic results from actions done. And the mechanism, you might say, what is the mechanism? Why does it work like that? It's in some ways the action and the result are a single thing, a single experience. If you do a negative action, the result of that negative action goes together with it almost indissolubly. But it seems like they are differentiated in time. So one appears a bit later or a lot later maybe than the other. But that's just simply how the thing operates. It's as though the result is a symbol, almost a physical or external symbol of the negative action itself. So if I harm others, my life might be short. And that's those two things coming together. One is the symbol of the other, almost the living symbol of the other. The shortness of my life is the symbol of the fact of my having injured and ill-treated people. People seem to squirm at this idea, and I never can understand why they squirm at the idea. Because it seems to me it's a very good explanation of the problem of what people call evil. Because the evil is actually something that we've created ourselves. It didn't come from outside. Wasn't particularly done by someone else. And somehow, if you have a consensus reality, you could be all getting into the same negativity yourselves. But that's in a sense, almost your choice. You decided to participate with everybody in the same kind of negativity. It's often said there's no such thing as group karma. I've heard it said. But there is group karma in the sense that if you can look at maybe, for example, you could had a lot of ants and you had something sugary and you looked at the pattern of the ants, you might see them all converging on this piece of sugar. Individually, they aren't converging as a group, but they're converging individually. But the overall appearance is they're converging as a group. So it's the same with what you might call mass karma or group karma. People have the same type of karma, makes them experience the same kinds of things. So you seem to have a mass movement, but it's simply because it's similar. I think of there's another very common idea of karma. Oh, I remember, yes, I was doing some meditation practice once at a place in the North Country. And one of the practices that we do is prostrating to all the Buddhas. So I'd been doing that. And the lady downstairs had complained to the management and said, there's somebody who seems to be throwing a sack of coals on the floor and pulling it across the floor. I'm afraid that was me. I didn't know there was anybody, or that the person below would have a problem with that. So the lady came, the manageress, as it were, came and spoke to me about it. And she said, I wouldn't take too much notice of it, she said. After all, it's her pain and it's her karma, she said extremely aggressively. That kind of aggressiveness, that a person is suffering, it's their karma, it's their fault, and therefore you are totally at liberty to do nothing whatever to help them. It's another great common idea. It's, again, tremendously accusatory and fault-finding. Of course, if somebody's saying, yeah, you could say it's their karma because they experience disturbance through something like that. On the other hand, you would go out to do something about it. You try and make it as good for them as possible, so to make something conducive to their meditation practice as well. So the obvious common sense things obtain whenever you've got these problems about karma. It is such a useful thing for attacking other people with. I'm not saying any of you would ever do that, but please remember it's a very important negative way of thinking of karma, just in those terms. I don't know whether, I can't think of nothing else springs to mind very strongly about what people think about karma, actually. Maybe, can somebody think of something that I haven't included?
Isn't there there's a tendency for some people to just trust in what's going to happen? So the lorry drivers in India go around corners very quickly because they say it's,
Yes.
karma will decide whether they fall off a cliff.
That's right. And in Malaysia, I remember somebody saying, well, we drive fast here, if we hit something, it's just karma. It's not really quite like that. Karma is action. It's not, I think it's like fate again, really, Really, you do the best to make sure you don't fall off the cliff edge. You make sure you don't really drive so fast you might bash into somebody and injure them. It's not fate. It's common sense, actually. A lot of Buddhist karma is enlightened common sense, really. Plus the fact that it's a simple fact. Actions produce results. And they do it above the board in ochre, completely over the board, as it were, if you want to use that expression, in terms of the things that are manifesting in the mirror. And that gives you an idea of how karma acts. You could ask yourself, it's an interesting question to ask yourself this, where does the action come from? And the action is quite mysterious, really, because actions do not proceed from sequences of cause and effect, because, again, there's something in the mirror. They don't appear through sequences of logic, because that's in the mirror as well. They don't come from simplistic causes like just saying it's mind in the ordinary sense of mind, or it comes by chains of association, which is just saying the same thing as I just said. But when you focus and you want to know where do actions arise from, this is an extremely mysterious place. It's a place beyond conceptual thought, beyond knowing. Actions actually arise spontaneously. And they arise, really, from the mirror itself. The mirror itself provides the volition beyond conceptual thought, which causes the appearances to arise within the mirror. But the results appear in the mirror. But the original action appears if you like, outside the mirror, or outside the reflectiveness of the mirror. Although we attribute it to the mirror, it's very important to realize where it comes from. It comes from something beyond the range of concepts. It's beyond the reach and the range of the mind, as somebody has said. I think we could have some questions if you have any at this point.
Yes, many years ago, the first book I discovered on Buddhism was the Christmas Humphreys one. And something he said in there that startled me and caused me to take interest in Buddhism, because this was a different way of thinking. He said that he had always wanted to be a prosecuting counsel and then a judge, because if people had done something wrong, they were going to need to face their karma sooner or later, and therefore he was doing a kindness by actually bringing them to justice sooner rather than later. I thought that was a rather startling point of view. I've never quite known whether to subscribe to it or not.
Yes, it is a rather startling point of view. Well, I would say, I suppose it's his point of view. Whether that could really be true or not, I think you would have to decide individually whether there was some kind of real basis, in fact, to your being like that? Am I the instrument of some justice? Am I the expressing the action of karma in some sense? Well, I suppose in some sense it's possible to say something like that, but I suppose just my own thought. I'd have my doubts, perhaps, about it. But I think it's a matter for the person who thinks like that to justify it to themselves, perhaps justify it to others if necessary. I've got a feeling it's not anything you could justify. Doesn't mean it's wrong, but I don't think you could justify it. And you think, well, I am that instrument of karma. Well, you can either say, I don't think you are, or you can say, well, maybe, or you say, good luck to you, I suppose, whatever. But that's about it, I think. Yeah, I wouldn't like to say anything more than that, I think. I could well believe that he thought that, yes.
Thank you. Could you say something about the idea of purifying one's own negative karma by, as I understand it, by being with whatever negativity might be in one's life in a way that so-called purifies it? Is there such a thing? And if there is that an action or is that a result?
It's a volition to decide to do that, so therefore it's karma. And it, generally speaking, it's a very good, very powerful karma of a good kind to stay with it. If you're in a situation, you have pain, difficult situation to be with, to stay with that, to be with that yourself, produces, we would think, good results to do that. We would think that the giving in a positive way to that situation enables you to perceive things more clearly. One of the difficulties, generally speaking, that people have with pain or with certain types of emotionality is the fighting and the resistance to it creates turmoil and problems. And it's very difficult for the mind to settle, and it's very difficult for some kind of real karmic action, strong action to take place. The more you can be with that, the better it is, the more likely that some genuine openness would begin to arise. Yes. I'm sure that's true. I'm sure, anyway, even if it seemed that it wasn't producing an effect somehow that seemed to be positive, I'm sure just staying with it and being open to it can't be anything other than good. Okay.
Can I ask a question about accident? You talked about random nature sometimes of what might happen to an individual, but when there are so many individuals with their own karmic tendencies on their own trajectories or pathways, it seems likely that there's some element of accident where our trajectories bump into each other. Yes. Or is that not the right way to think of it?
No, I don't think that's true. I think that's what happens. We do bump into each other, karmically speaking, and a certain randomness is present. That's true. I think what you're saying is correct. You just try and work with all those situations that arise in your experience. And usually plenty of things do arise that you can work with. It's just the way it is mostly. Yes, like I was saying about Christian notions, I don't feel there's really a problem about that kind of thing happening. Certainly not from Buddhist perspective. You expect people to experience pain you experience, you expect it to be what perhaps Christians would describe as the problem of pain being that there seems no rhyme or reason for it. From our point of view, of course, there always is. It comes from the past karmic actions of individuals. And part of the milieu that happens is the jangling and the bashing together of people's lives that are experiencing different streams of experience that have different kinds of pain in them. So yeah, I think you're right.
It's just if you look, sometimes something seems that initially accidental, and then later in life you wonder if it was. Like physical laws and always just set, or whether it operated on different individuals differently.
Well, it might act differently. For example, maybe you could see, if you could take a bird's eye or a God's eye view, if you like, of two cars approaching each other, you might think there's an inevitability of a crash. And you might say, well, nothing could be done about that. The people weren't reacting in time and so forth. The question is whether, is that an accident or is it karma? Well, it's an accident in some sense, but it's also karma because people experience the things they do experience because of the actions they've done in the past. It doesn't mean perhaps inevitably they're going to have a car crash, but you're going to have something happen. It's going to ripen in some way. And maybe somebody else is crashing, their karma is ripening. Maybe it just comes together and they ripen at the same time. It might happen, of course, in this view of the world because the world is not just a material place. There's a way in which mind and symbolism and the meaning of all that is happening simultaneously somehow.
Rigdzin Shikpo, thinking about a car crash in connection to Trungpa Rinpoche, can you talk about karma in the life of someone like Trungpa Rinpoche?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Generally speaking, if he was your guru, you're taking a special viewpoint. Your viewpoint is that he is not an ordinary person and you need to interpret his actions and what happens to him in a different way. The word karma, which generally, of course, means action, an action producing a result, has a sense quite often as being negative actions producing negative karmic results and so on. There's also what's called Buddha karma, means actions springing from the enlightened mind. And they produce a result of a kind, but they're not, it's not that they're particularly positive, but it's like they transcend that idea of positive and negative. Buddha actions produce situations from which all beings may be able to benefit. And one thinks that one's guru is able to link into that. If you weren't taking Trungpa Rinpoche as a guru, if you thought of him as an ordinary person somehow, excuse me, then you would, excuse me, then you would interpret his actions perhaps in more ordinary terms. But that's a matter for you, really. It's always possible to interpret actions in ordinary ways and in extraordinary ways. There's always the possibility of both interpretations, and depends on whether that person is your guru, in which case you do it in an extraordinary way, or not your guru particularly, in which case you may choose the ordinary option. And if you say which one is right, it's not sure that you can answer that question. Because it's just the idea of point of view. And point of view isn't as easy as it sounds. because in some ways a lot of things are simply connected to. It's like human beings or beings in general, maybe the world in general, like nodes of action, which is karma. So karma radiates from every point of the world in some sense, perhaps. And also they produce results. It produces results as it radiates in that way. So the world is a continual dynamic play of a mysterious nature of volition that comes from the aliveness of things, which is not just the aliveness of human beings, and producing some kind of result experienced in the world, which then could be interpreted by people who didn't have your particular view as the material world working in a particular way. So the idea that the idea is karma can produce very powerful things if, for example, the person who is putting it forth has the power of samadhi, for example, of really deep, profoundly concentrated mind. Then they're able to make things happen with that kind of mind. It is said that even that great bodhisattvas and Buddhas can create pure lands or almost universes into which other people who are not so connected to Dharma can participate. Now the question is what that means. Have they created another world somewhere? Well, you might say that. Or you might say they are just able to reinterpret this same world for different beings. They have the power to do that. But then what's the difference between that and reconstructing the world anyway? What does it mean? Where do you draw the line between the two? Is there a line you can draw between the two? There's the four karmas, they say. The karma to make peace, the karma to produce increase, to enrich. Third karma is the karma to draw towards you, to fascinate, to enthrall almost, which sounds like it might be a bit naughty. But the idea is drawing people in to your domain for Dharma purposes. And the fourth one is to destroy what needs to be destroyed. So those are the four kinds of karma that are done by Buddhas. Sometimes they say there's a fifth karma, which is the karma of anything we may have forgotten in the previous four. Anything else?
Within Shikpo, earlier on you mentioned how it's consensus that builds reality rather than reality that builds consensus. And I was very interested to hear that because given that the external world is illusory, or our perception of it is illusory, I've always wondered why there is so much consensus in it.
Yeah.
But I was just wondering, why is there any consensus? I mean, if there isn't something out there that's there independent of us that we can start agreeing on, if I've been building up my own karma in my own particular way for eons, why have I got any sort of anything at all in common with these other beings out there?
Yeah.
So, I mean, is it something to do with, you mentioned the fact that we're all islands which are extensions of the bedrock? I mean, is there some fundamental link that we have that keeps us together in a sense?
There is in some sense, and that is the fact that, I mean, one extreme thing would be to say that all things are equally probable. You realise if that were the case, then everything would be total chaos, because you wouldn't be able to favour anything over another. So if you look round everywhere, everything would look equally the same in all directions. So, I mean, it would be like just a white space with white noise, I guess. Everything be white everywhere, because everything would be equal. Well, the fact is, the world has the interestingness it has, because things are not symmetrical in that way, because there are biases and so on. You could say, and I don't know whether this is true, it probably is, might be true physically, if within such a, let's call it, giant pea soup, and you introduce some unstable element, just a small one, it grows and grows, and eventually things start forming patterns of various kinds. I think that's possible that it works like that. Of course, you could still say, how did the original instability arise, I suppose? I could pass you back, I suppose, to a kind of Dzogchen remark about movement. Said talking about what primordially exists, which the idea is it cannot move. So it says, in what cannot move, there is a movement, smaller than the 100th part of a horse's hair. And what they call the vasana, or the tendency of movement, is present in the primordial nature of reality itself. So there is a vibration, as it were, that is inherently or intrinsically present in it. If you say, why is there? I suppose there's no answer to that. Except that you could say, if everything is if the most fundamental thing is that everything is uncertain, then if you take that there's a point where everything is just equally probable and you've just got kind of whiteness everywhere, then if there is an uncertainty in there somewhere, there's an uncertain movement that happens in it. If there's an uncertain movement, it would be the beginning of this clustering effect that makes a pattern emerge from it. So you could say it's all automatic. Sounds a bit like physics, but never mind. The point is, if it works, what does it matter? The other way of doing it, which is perhaps slightly more Buddhistically, well, I think that's quite Buddhistic, actually, what I just said. So I'll cross that line out, saying it's not particularly Buddhistic, it is. But another way things are expressed is to say that within the primordial nature of the mind, which is like this great mirror, is the mysterious and magical manifestations of what they call the mandala of the jinas, the mandala of the conquerors, the mandala of the Buddhas, which means kind of coherent patterns of kind of an alive quality that appears within the magic of the mirror's internal brightness, as it were. So you suddenly get sort of pictures appearing, and they do that spontaneously. You can't say why is it like that. You say, well, it's like that because it is like that. There's no answer to it fundamentally. It appears because it's that movement, that play, that appearance is spontaneously existent or self-existent, and it appears. The jina mandalas appear. The jina mandalas, the mandalas of the Buddhas appear. They are, if you like, sort of perfect. But then some confusion gets mixed with them, and then they stop, then they become like the ordinary world that we're familiar with. The ordinary world of us and them, the ordinary world of objects, the ordinary world of, plants, animals, trees, minerals, the world, the planets, whatever. They become ways the jina mandala can manifest itself, or the jina mandalas can manifest itself. And they all appear within the mirror somehow. So if that's an explanation, it's an explanation. Otherwise, you can fall back on the other one, and if that doesn't satisfy you, well, that's probably the end of the line.
Your first explanation is actually exactly what modern physicists say about the evolution of the universe, and the reason that matter is clumped up rather than spread out evenly is exactly the same explanation.
Well, it's the same as a Buddhist viewpoint, really, because those collecting together is the play between the two things, the manifestation of things in a kind of vastness, and also in terms of mandalas. Mandala just means a particular kind of structure, really. So almost anything could be a mandala. It's got a certain coherence, a certain guiding principle, and it's patterning of some kind.
And the Buddhists got there first.
It would seem so. I have a physicist, quite well known in Oxford circles as a physicist, among other physicists. He used to come and see me sometimes. And he used to, I wouldn't say slightly gloomily, he used to say, yeah, all these things you tell me about, he said, it's quite interesting. He said, we're still worrying about all these things, and they've already been looked at hundreds of years ago, or thousands of years ago sometimes. So it seemed very true. I think it's quite amazing that somebody like Longchen Rabjam had sort of foreseen a lot of these things, and in that sense he's very modern. Yeah. Anything else?
Shikpo, just a very quick question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what you just described about the mandala of genius manifesting in the mirror as an unstable, still patterned kind of movement, is that what Trungpa Rinpoche refers as orderly chaos?
Do you know, I'm not too sure, I'm ashamed to say. I'm not too sure I remember what he says in Orderly Chaos for that. I'll have to look now. You've mentioned it. Sally, you must remind me to look when you have to dig it out and have a look. I don't know.
But is there an element, I mean, it doesn't matter, but is there an element of chaos in that manifestation?
Well, in the sense that chaos has a certain randomness associated with it. Orderly, there is it's not, as I say, it's not, can't be totally random. There has to be the two elements going on, some kind of conditioning factors and some kind of uncertainty. It's interesting that in physics we talk about uncertainty. And there it is, in the Buddhist text, this actual term is used, mangepa, means uncertainty. It's quite interesting, that. I'm not saying they had quantum theory particularly, but who knows, maybe they did. I haven't just come across it. Anything else?
Rigdzin, Shikpo, you've been very clear that karma's not related to fate. I wonder if you could say a bit more about what the Buddhist philosophy of fate is, if it has any role to play at all.
Do we have a Buddhist philosophy of fate, really? I don't think we have anything really like that. We certainly have the idea that it's always possible to perform some kind of action that would be meaningful or significant. Certainly, sometimes people seem to be very oppressed by the conditions they're in, and find it difficult to know what to do. And that certainly could be quite an ongoing problem. Might not be easy to think of anything that you could do. In that case, you would have to practice Dharma as well as you could. If you had the opportunity to go to a teacher, then you would. However, of course, it is true that there are times when, for whatever reason, it's not very easy to practice the Dharma. It said that there are times in the world when there are no teachers around, Buddhas haven't appeared, the teaching is not available. You wouldn't call that fate, though. You'd say that was due to conditions, actions that you yourself have participated in, giving yourself a kind of problem. And naturally, if you were able to kind of perceive that going on for people, you feel very compassionate and do the best you could. But you'd also realise there's a saying that in spite of what you can do through passion, through compassion, through love and so on, people go the way of their karma because they've done what actions they have done. They are self-constrained by their own activities. And in some ways you may not be able to do much about that. You may be able to provide them with certain opportunities and help to get them out of their difficult situation, but still might be very difficult. It's very difficult to say. The whole history of Dharma is that there are times when it's very good, situation is very good, Buddhas have appeared in the world, everything's going beautifully. And then it said that the opposite, there are times that are very bad, Buddhas haven't appeared. There's painful conditions, Dharma doesn't seem to be around, people hurt each other and behave badly to each other. One asks for the reason, then the reason is, as I say, it's the karma of beings. It's not fate. As time passes, that situation will ease up. There'll be maybe the opportunity of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to get in there and help people. But sometimes all that's a rather slow process. It would be nice if it weren't a slow process, but it often is. So, let's say this, perhaps in summary. There is no situation where beings are overwhelmed by a malign fate about which they can do nothing at all. Just that some situations it's very easy to gain punya, to increase your connections to awakening and so on, and some situations in which it's extremely difficult. But all situations change. That's all one can say, I think, really. Anything else anybody wants to ask?
Rigdzin Shikpo, kind of following on from that, but also something you were saying about this morning. If you feel yourself to be particularly trapped in the world that you find yourself in, if you find it particularly claustrophobic, is it okay to take sort of comfort from the idea that it's illusory? I'm just asking because sometimes I wonder if that's a bit of a cop-out.
If it helps in making the world seem less solid, I don't think it's a problem. If it also makes you feel, well, doesn't matter how I behave to people, then that's not good. So it depends. It's like a lot of Buddhist things. It just depends on what effect it has on you to think in a particular way. Buddhists often have just kind of a lot of ideas about, well, it's all right to think like this. You could think like this. You could think like that. You could think like something else. In some ways, it doesn't matter how you think, but what's important is what effect it has on you when you think like that. Often, some view you might have about the world and about beings and how they work together. Any view you have about the world is going to be wrong anyway, because there are no truly correct views that are sort of absolute 100% about things, because the world doesn't work like that. It doesn't work in terms of conceptual frameworks. But nevertheless, sometimes some frameworks like that inspire you or make you feel you can think or act or work in a particular way that is beneficial. In which case, we'd often say, well, think like that. It's kind of quite good to do that. If it's got a problematic aspect associated with it, then you don't think like that. Even you might have the idea, well, when I'm working in this way, then I'll think like this. When I'm working in another way, I'll think in a different way. I'll focus on something else. Sometimes that will work. It's quite good to learn to be flexible in the way you think and not think that necessarily you have to have a view of the world that is exactly the same in all areas. It may not be necessary to have that. So does that help?
Thank you.
Good. Anything else?
Yes, Shikpo. If actions produce results and are the fruit of the actions, where's the volition come from in the first place? Where does that arise from?
Well, that was the thing I said was tremendously mysterious. When you actually look to see the point, where do actions come from? You haven't done the Lance Roar, I suppose, have you?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So you've done it completely.
No.
You've got two.
I've done 2 years.
Ah, so got quite to the gate. All right. In gate 4, we go into actions.
Yeah.
That's the. Well, you will have done that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've done gate 4. So you do know. It's the so-called fountain of goodness, or the fount of all goodness, we say, or the fountain of youth. And the idea is there's a moment, an experience beyond thought, as it were, from which volitions arise in a way which is totally mysterious. And when they appear in that way, and if you really focus on that, then they're very powerful, and because they don't have things going round them, as it were, telling you they come from somewhere else. You can see where they come from. They come spontaneously arisen from this kind of ground of everything. You're going to experience that initially as an inspiration, as something that is genuine and significant, rather than you're going to have a vision of things somehow rising at that point. But you feel that that moment of arising is very genuine, very truthful, very magnificent in some sense. But you will not ever really know what it is or where it comes from. It doesn't come from anywhere except it's what you might call itself. It's self-existent at that point. It comes into being. The action radiates out of that. It's performed by that. It's what Trungpa Rinpoche calls first thought, best thought. It's not possible really to say further than that where actions come from. It's like you've got to the last thing that you can say. Because if you tried to say, well, they come from somewhere else, then you'd have a problem of saying, well, where does that come from? So we stop at the point of saying things arise in this way of the fountain of youth, meaning something is fresh and new. This action arises spontaneously. It's completely fresh. It's completely new. You've no idea where it's come from. It's like newly created. That's all you can say about it, really.
Does that mean, Rigdzin Shikpo, that you're never going to know whether that spontaneously arisen volition and the action that comes from it is actually the result of previous karma?
Well, it can't be, because it's a karma. So results of karma aren't karma. So when the moment of action that arises is not the result of anything.
But I mean, the volition.
Yeah, the volition itself. The volition is the karma.
Okay.
You're not going to be able to say anything about it. It just burst, newly arisen, newly created into the world somehow. Something, you might say, kind of radiates out of that, comes from that. But you can't go further back than the point where it arises from the ground. It's like the fountain arising from the ground. I mean, it's true that if it was an actual fountain, you'd be able to say, well, there's water below the ground and so on. This is a different kind of ground. It's got any antecedents somehow. So you would just be able to say, well, it comes and that's it. I'm not going to be able to say any more than that. I might be able to say things like, it's very wonderful, it's astonishing, it's the freshness and newness of it, the poignancy of it. All these are amazing, astonishing, remarkable, put me in a place I could not otherwise conceive of. But, you know, if you tried to say, well, where does it come from, you wouldn't actually be able to say.
I'm just thinking that from your side, that's what that would be your experience, but maybe someone from outside would look at what you were doing and say, well, you're doing that because of what happened.
Well, they may think that, but that's up to them.
Yes.
As far as you're concerned, you have the experience of it arising in this particular way. And there's a tremendous nakedness and openness in that experience, which you would never get from just saying in your mind, well, it comes from something else. So that's freedom, the uncontrivedness is very special.
That sounds like two different views, because if you have a view A hits B, Fred
Sorry,
hits
I actually missed what you said. A flurry?
person A, Alfred hits Bertie, right?
All right.
Okay.
A and B, yes.
A and B, okay. Bertie, so that's the action.
Yes.
Bertie then hits Alfred back again, so that's
Yes.
the result.
Yes.
And then that's also an action which gives birth to another result, and on it goes like that.
But it might not go on like that. I mean, if you looked at what Bertie doesn't have to do what he does, but he might do.
But if it does, then that's an endless cycle. That is the endless cycle of action.
Yeah,
and
but
result.
that's...
Or you think about it that nothing causes anything, and all the hittings and all of that is are just in themselves spontaneously arisen actions.
Well, depends which way you want to look at it, really. Yeah, but I mean, if you want to look at it in as profound a way as you can, you look at the point of spontaneously arising actions. You may say that the arising of that remarkable action, which is associated with the fountain of youth, arises and fits in with some kind of pattern of actions. But you wouldn't say it's caused by that. You would just say, well, it fits that pattern. It's not a question of causality, it's just a question of the way the elements of the pattern come together. But you wouldn't, to call it causality is really not very useful, really, from this point of view. You see, what you're not saying is that all the spontaneous actions that happen externally looked at in a particularly totally random way. Because if you did, there wouldn't be any patterns at all. So you'd say everything that arises through some kind of pattern. But the pattern isn't causality. Pattern is just the patterned way in which things appear. If you actually look at what happens to the volition itself, then it arises in this very special, magical fashion, as it were, apparently out of nothing. If you wanted to say, well, it's constrained by some kind of pattern, I suppose one might say that, but I'm not quite sure that it would mean very much, because one's not saying it's being tied to a particular set of conditions, just there's a pattern operating, and it seems to fit into that pattern. It's not certain what the action will be. It's not certain that Bertie will hit Alfred, actually. But he might.
Can I ask about choice? I mean, does Bertie actually have a choice as whether he hits Alfred, or will his choice depend entirely on previous conditions?
Well, it's difficult to know what Bertie's choice might be, really, because Bertie can't really be considered to look round all the possible actions, weigh them up and then choose, because looking round and weighing up are all themselves complex activities to do with apparent causalities and logical chains of effects. So you're not really getting out of that. You're just embroiling yourself more and more in the same kind of activity. So you're really in the situation of saying that Bertie's action arises spontaneously. Nobody makes Bertie's action happen. There is no Bertie to say. If Bertie is anything, Bertie is the moment the action appears. If Bertie is anything, he's that action. But you could say that a pattern is being followed and Bertie's action is part of the pattern. You might be able to say that. I don't know what this sounds like to you. What I'm trying to say is that you aren't talking about causality. You aren't talking about chains of logic. But you are talking about things that fall into some kind of pattern. The reason why, what's the power, the force behind the patterning, the reason why things form into the pattern they do, I could say it's because of the activity of the Jina mandalas. I could say that. They're there, they are the kinds of patterns you're talking about. Because those patterns of the Jina mandalas are there, that's why there is a tendency for Bertie to do one particular thing rather than another. Because, one is not saying everything is all the same. Otherwise, as we said, you just have chaos. But at the same time, I don't want to talk about causality because that's associated with the strength of grasping mind again. So there's a problem with that. I can't say Bertie's actions are determined because that's a graspable thing. I can't say his actions are free. I can't say his actions are totally determined because they're obviously not. They're not also totally free. You might say they form a pattern which indicates they are partly free and partly uncertain. There's an uncertain quality about it which might be described as a play between free and determined, perhaps. But it's not very sensible to talk about that in terms of causality, chains of logic and so on. Only that there is a kind of pattern. And you might say the pattern maybe indicates some kind of statistical distribution of possible actions, maybe. That Bertie is more likely under some circumstances to do one particular action than another. But in fact, you can't say what Bertie will actually do. If you could imagine the statistical Bertie over many possible ways Bertie might act, which you can't really be, then you'd say maybe Bertie is more likely to hit Alfie than not.
So does the pattern exist in the potentiality rather than in the result?
Well, I mean, you could say that, I suppose, but it's just a pattern expresses itself somehow, like the pattern of the genus. The pattern of the genus are mandalas. The mandala of genus are just patterns, really, of appearances and manifestations and so on. One wanted to say they were caused by anything. You don't have linear causes, and you don't grasp at things called causes, and you don't grasp or link into lines of logic particularly. It's just there is this ongoing, I mean, like in the Avatamsaka Sutra, or the teaching on it, you might talk about, loosely, I suppose, causality through the Dharma Dhatu. Because the great space of everything there is the way that it is. Patterns continually emerge with different aspects and different dynamics. And that is an ongoing thing somehow. You don't want to talk about ordinary notions of causality or ordinary notions of logic particularly. But you can talk about the emergence of some kind of pattern. If you didn't have the emergence of some kind of pattern, as I said, you'd just have a kind of chaos, really. You wouldn't have any apparent world at all unless there was some process of patterning going on. But you still have the mysteriousness of the moment when spontaneously a volition arises. I don't know, that doesn't sound as though it's very helpful, but I think it's probably nothing more we can do, really. And what one is trying to say, there's a pattern of things, experiences, the dynamic manifestation of the universe, and from all that, the new universe is ever creating and emerging from itself as a whole series of patterns. What we are trying to avoid saying is that there are such things as causes to which on which you can fixate yourself, or sequences of logic on which you can fixate yourself somehow.
Again, that would seem to be completely supported by modern physics. The picture of quantum mechanics and how, sort of statistically you can say something about an outcome, but never actually deterministically is exactly the same. It sounds like. So.
Yeah, I think it's similar. So, there's a certain point where you can't say more. That's all. It's like, if you follow the physics analogy, like the idea of hidden variables, the apparent randomness, if you like, of quantum mechanics is actually there is something mysterious going on underneath. But in fact, that isn't the canonical way of thinking of quantum mechanics. You don't think there's anything hidden like that underneath. You just think that there is just this emergence of things according to the probability patterns, if you like. There isn't anything more than that. In all things, when you're talking about ultimate questions, there's always a point where you have to stop. Because there's always a point at which if you want to think in terms of causes or conditions or streams of logic, you always say, well, what was the one before that? At some point you have to stop. The point is, what is the meaningful and significant place to stop? And we say it's here. Other people might have other ideas. Is everybody gloriously happy with that? I didn't think you were.
So karma operates just according to one of these patterns?
Yes, that's right. You got it in one. Yes, that's right. That's exactly what it does.
Unpredictably?
Yeah. Well, yeah, but when we say, we don't mean unpredictably in that every possible outcome is equally probable. You know, otherwise, as I say, you'd have everything equally probable is like just white soup everywhere.
So there's almost a sense of causality linking the patterns.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, that probably if you tried to think of the patterns as introduce some kind of approximation and said these patterns are some kind of unit thing, and you looked at how they related to each other, you might be able to say that they formed some kind of, had some kind of rules relating them together. They would only be, relatively speaking, it might be convenient. Like when you look at things en masse and you see that they seem to follow some kind of pattern, like the mass movement of objects, maybe, even though they consist of atoms and molecules linked together in certain ways. You see that you can have rules of mechanics that describe the movements of the forces between these objects. But the objects, after all, really are bound together with the electromagnetic forces, well, mostly. And they're most significant when you're dealing with the molecules and the atoms. But they don't come into play in ordinary mechanics. You don't consider that. It's forces between objects and the movements that exist between them and so forth. And you can work out a kind of pattern for that of a different kind. If you wanted to say, well, why is this solid? That's another question. Then you'd have to talk about electromagnetism then. But if you don't bother about why is it solid, but only interested in how the forces connected with my fist and the reaction that the piece of wood or the chair might have on it, you can deal with that if you don't want to go further. If you want to ask more searching questions, you would go into the tremendous power there is in electromagnetism over short distances, that kind of thing.
On this same sort of patterns coming out, people sometimes observe that kind of the fruit of karma may appear to be humorous in some way, or teasing, and other people talk about poetic justice.
Yes, they do, and there seems to be some meaning in that.
Would it be wrong to ascribe some kind of positive teaching aspect to the way that karma fruits?
I wouldn't like to say that wasn't true. Yeah, I think there is a kind of humour in the universe. I'm not sure people like that idea very much, because there's also a way in which the universe is full of treachery and deception. But there's also a kind of humour in it, rather grim humour sometimes, perhaps. But yes, it's almost like there's a kind of game going on all the time, a game which is an interesting game, but a game sometimes that involves trickery, deception, treachery of some kind. Also comes some kind of humorousness. The humorousness might involve some kind of trickery in some sense. But that's quite a big area to get into, actually. For example, does the living nature of the universe actually trick you into doing things that you wouldn't do in order to benefit you? In the universe, in this sense, being, say, prajna, as a living force for good, is trying to betray you through your own mental defilements, good or bad. Supposing something is held out to you as this wonderful thing that you want, you really go for it. And it turns out it's not what you wanted after all. And it's all rather horrible when you get there. And yet good comes out of it in the end. Was it a good thing to be treacherously treated like that? Because the universe seems to do it, according to some Buddhist conceptions. The universe is alive, it would seem, in a remarkable way, and in quite a tricky way. You know, there is the idea of the dance of Maya, the goddess Maya, who is dancing, and you become enthralled and you become entranced by watching her perform her amazing and attractive and seductive dance. But she may be leading you somewhere into some area that you didn't realise you were being led into. And there may be two aspects to that. You may be, because there's a strong element of confusion associated with that, you may be going down to some real treacherous unpleasantness. But the treachery might be a treachery that wakes you up and helps to lead you to enlightenment. So both of those are possible. You know, you have to go further into Dharma, much further perhaps, to start looking at this play. So one of the things you have to do as a student is to look at the play of Maya, the play of deception and treachery and that which taunts you, leads you in a direction you didn't want to go, and so on. Realise how that works, sometimes for good, sometimes for apparently bad. And how much of that is associated with loss of memory. Suppose you forget that. Maybe part of the duplicitousness of things is knowing that you will forget and relying on your forgetfulness to use it to create some further deceit somehow, which again might be good or bad. It's said that Mara will behave in a treacherous way to lead you further and further into samsara, like will-o'-the-wisps that lead you into further into a marshland where you'll get stuck. That kind of imagery is used in the examples, the 8 examples of Maya, for example. So it's a very interesting, very provoking, very necessary area to understand and know about. You can't understand Dharma without understanding the seduction, the treachery, the deception of the world. And the fact that it's some kind of living quality associated with it. And that it could be good and it could be bad. I mean, is a mother right to deceive a child to do something for its own good? Or should you always just be honest all the time and say, no, this thing will happen to you, perhaps. some pleasant thing might happen if you do this. But it'll be good. I think children are not likely to take much notice of that.
Rigdzin, Shikpo, I looked up volition in the dictionary, or in several dictionaries, because I noticed you used it a lot in your books, and it wasn't, what the dictionaries came up with wasn't really very satisfactory in terms of understanding it through what you mean in your books. What it said in the dictionary, it said that volition was, in a nutshell, will, but I don't think
Yeah.
it's not what you mean.
No.
Right,
I just think they're wrong then in that case. So that disposes of that.
Yeah.
Volition to me is an action that you do, but it's not a will, because will presupposes, it's always built in the West, presupposes ego. And the ego is doing something or making something happen. But in Buddhism, there is no ego in that sense. It's something you see as empty. So therefore, there isn't any will either. If you meant something else by will and just meant the mental, say, activity that starts the process of something happening further in the mind or in the body or in speech, that is what would be meant by that. But that's no more than saying it's volition. The trouble with, of course, dictionary definitions is that, as you know, if you follow dictionary definitions around, they go round in a circle and come back to where they started from, because that's the nature of books that are reference books. There's nothing else you can do than that. I'm sure everybody's done the similar thing, turned black into white, haven't you, by looking up dictionary definitions of black. And then black goes to dark, dark goes to pale, pale goes to light, light goes to white. So you've gone from dark to white in about 6 lookups of the dictionary. And then you could go back to dark again. I won't bother with doing it anymore. But I think if you think volition simply means the action, the impulsion that you put forward in your mind to start a process which produces a fruit of some kind, like the movement of an arm, you're speaking in some way, or further mental activity. I think that covers it, really. So one doesn't need to worry too much about the dictionary definition, maybe. Is there anything else anybody wants to ask?
Rigdzin, Shikpo, I wondered with practicing Dharma how it seems to undermine certain conditions, let's say in the West, where it's quite materialistic. A practitioner might be less affected by that. I wondered whether that meant that those conditions might manifest again in another life at another time if they've been undermined through doing the spiritual practice.
I think the more undermined the sort of grasping at material things are, I think that continues. But undermining is a slow process. And it's quite amazing that you can apparently have a very strong experience of the collapse of things you hold on to very strongly. And it seems somehow, almost by magic, it returns again, almost as strong as before. All you can say is it's not quite as strong as before, because you have that knowledge, that insight, that it has collapsed, that there is a worm in the bud, as it were. Somehow there you'll find that in the end it won't. You won't be able to. It won't be a meaningful thing that you can carry through completely. There's something that does undermine it, and I think that will continue for you long after this life. It's a slow process, I think, of things coming together and producing an effect over a long period. I'm using ordinary language here, of course. I wouldn't like you to think I believed in effects as such or causes as such. It's just a manner of speaking. You often use manners of speaking, in science even. You might say, as I've used as an example, you could say, well, the light in the room comes on because I switched the light on. But that's just a quick shorthand way of talking about a whole set of events, interconnections and conditions which cause the light to emerge out of the glass bulb. Anything else?
Rigdzin, Shikpo, I guess there were a number of things today that you talked about that you could trace back to Longchenpa. Is there anything specifically you think that he said about karma particularly?
As such, he said the usual things that are said about karmas. I wouldn't say in that way he was saying anything very different. I don't know that he had any particular thing about karma. Not that he may well have done, but I don't know what it was if he did say it.
But that kind of patterning that you're talking
Oh
about.
yeah, I see what you mean. No, I can't think of anything. I think mostly when he's mentioning karma in a less usual way, he's talking about it in terms of the mirror of the mind,
Yes.
and things appearing in that. I think he does that.
Right.
But I don't know anything about the patterns as such. The only thing you could say would be about the Jina mandalas themselves. He certainly does refer to those, even though those quotes are from a text called the Magical Net sometimes, the ones about the Jina mandalas.
Right.
But, it's all very interesting how it fits together. But I don't know any further thing I can tell you about the patterns of karma appearing in terms of the Jina mandalas particularly. No, I might, if I come across them, I'll let you know. Anything else? Well, if there isn't anything, maybe we could call a halt there. Thank you very much for listening so carefully, and hope to see you all again sometime.
Thank you on behalf of everyone here for an absolutely wonderful afternoon, for very inspiring teachings, and we hope that you'll be able to come back and teach us again in the future. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd certainly like to do that. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everybody who's actually made this into a Jina mandala today. I think the setup was really beautiful. I think you've all worked very, really hard to make it happen. And I hope everyone sort of joins in with that. And when we have another one, you can come along and help too.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.